When you hear the word integrity, what does that mean to you? What does it make you think of? Maybe it's a person or an institution or a way of life that comes to mind when you think about integrity. Maybe you've had experience with people that lacked it, or maybe you've had seasons in your life where you know that you should have had more integrity. But the truth about the word integrity is that it really comes from the math realm, if you will. That it comes from like the same root word that we get the word integer, like a whole number. And when we talk about having integrity, really what that means is that we are whole, that we don't have like a divided way of living where we say one thing but do another thing, or where we say something in one setting but say something totally different in another setting, or we treat certain kind of people one way but other people a different way, a life that's kind of fragmented or fractioned up into different kinds of ways of loving. A life of integrity is just a life where we are whole, that we're the same, that we're treating people the exact same way in any kind of different setting that we experience. And one of the things that we see happening in the book of Acts is we're in this series, The Way, where we've been looking at what God is doing in the lives of these first followers of Jesus, is we see people being made whole because of what Jesus did. We see people that were outsiders being invited into the family of God. We see people that didn't come from the best places or the best families or any of that stuff. We see them being empowered to use their God-given gifts to radically change this world. We see people growing in a life of integrity and wholeness because of what Jesus did. And the thing is, as we look at what's happening in these first followers of Jesus, we have to be reminded that it's not just what God was doing then, but it's what he wants to do in us now. That God invites us to participate in his story. And no matter what our background is, no matter what our past is or hurts are, God invites us into new life, whole life, abundant life because of what Jesus has done for us. But we're in Acts chapter 5 today, and the truth is we're going to look at probably one of the more difficult passages in all of the Bible. I wonder what your experience is like if you read a part of the Bible that's hard to understand or confusing to understand, or maybe it doesn't seem right to you even. What do you do with it when you get to one of those sections? You just, I can't make sense of why this is happening in the story of the Bible. Now, the way that we handle this is when we get to a part of the Bible that's hard to understand, we have a choice to make. We can either reject that part of the Bible, kind of if we were going through like a buffet line and we kind of like pick out the foods we like, but then we leave behind the ones we want. Like, no, I don't feel like that today. We can treat the Bible like that. Or we can lean into these stories to understand the bigger picture of the master creator behind the whole thing. Maybe like going to a gourmet meal presented by a chef. You might have things presented to you like, I don't know about that. It might look kind of interesting, or maybe something you think you don't like. But that chef might be trying to put together the whole story. It's kind of interesting because one of the people that liked kind of like picking their way through the Bible was one of the forefathers of America, one of the most influential people in human history, Thomas Jefferson. Right? He's actually famous for having his own version of the Bible. And what Thomas Jefferson did is he actually cut out sections of the Bible that he didn't like or he didn't agree with. And so you can actually see what his Bible looked like when he just chopped out the parts that he didn't like. Now, what's interesting is what are the parts that he cut out? Thinking maybe some of the rules in the Old Testament or some of the stories about like war and domination and all that stuff. Maybe are some of those things. What's interesting about Thomas Jefferson is the part of his Bible that he cut out were the miracles of Jesus and the resurrection. I'm like, huh? That's kind of the whole thing is about. Like, if you're going to leave behind the miracles of Jesus and the resurrection, I'm not interested. But I guess Thomas Jefferson struggled with maybe the supernatural nature of who Jesus is. I was at a meal a while back with some friends of mine, and it's actually something that I had helped arrange, but we had a chef cooking for us, and he planned this whole meal out, and he had multiple different parts of the meal that he wanted to share with us. But his whole point in sharing this meal with us is that we might understand both some of the struggles of this life and also the goodness of God through food. And it was a really beautiful night to spend with some close friends. But the truth is, as he presented each dish, some of them really caught us in our tracks. Like, that looks weird. Or, I've had that before and I didn't like it. But he challenged us to try each part of the meal. And together, every different dish that he presented kind of put this whole story together of the abundance of God, of the goodness of God, of the grace of God in our lives. And it was a beautiful evening together, even though all of us were stretched beyond our comfort zones. And all of us maybe tried something that we otherwise wouldn't have been that entitled to try. The same thing is kind of the reality when we get to parts of the Bible that are hard to understand. Instead of just kind of leaving them behind or rejecting those parts and kind of saying, not interested, what happens if we lean in to those stories and understand that it's telling a bigger picture? Because the entire Bible, from beginning to end, tells one unified story of the God who loves us, of the God who loves you and loves me. So we're going to read from Acts chapter 5, and it's just a few verses. And there's ways in which you read these and it almost stops you in your tracks. But then we're going to lean in to see what it tells us about the God who authored this book. Acts 5, starting in verse 1. Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. Then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied just to human beings, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died, and great fear seized all who heard what had happened. Then some young men came forward, wrapped up his body, and carried him out and buried him. About 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, Tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Yes, she said, that is the price. Peter said to her, How could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. At that moment, she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, and finding her dead, carried her out and buried her beside her husband. Great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events. Over the years, we've had a number of people come to our community terrified, anxious that maybe the moment they walked through the doors, that the place would be struck by lightning or would combust, or maybe they would be struck down themselves. And I know you might be one of those people. And though we've never seen that happen, I can understand maybe when you read certain parts of the Bible why you might be anxious about some of those things happening. See, this is a hard story to understand. But the reality is that before there was FTX, before there was Madoff, before there was Enron, there was Ananias and Sapphira. And a case of financial fraud threatened these early followers of Jesus for the very first time from the inside. See, this group of followers, that their lives are being changed by Jesus. They're seeing God so powerfully at work in them that people are being healed, needs are being met, people are discovering new and abundant life in Jesus. And they are being threatened every day from the outside. People are threatening them, saying, you can't talk like this anymore. You can't participate in this community anymore. You can't tell people about Jesus anymore. And they're threatening them to imprison them, to scorn them, maybe to beat them, maybe to kill them if they keep going. There have been outside threats since the very beginning. But this is the first time in this young community of followers of Jesus that we see an internal threat. We just talked about last week how there's sort of this rich love for one another that is growing because of the good news of Jesus. The one that says we have a provider that gives us abundantly more than we need. And because of that, if we happen to have a little extra, we can sell it or give it away to meet the needs of others so that they might understand the goodness of God as well. But then we see this case of these two individuals that they make a decision in their own hearts to say one thing and do another. Instead of leaning into wholeness and integrity, they decide to live a divided life where they would be dishonest and corrupt in the way that they go about this thing. It's interesting that the very first thing that threatened the church was a case of financial fraud, because it's something that continues to threaten churches and organizations to this very day. And in fact, it might be one of the reasons why you might be hesitant to be generous or to give to an organization like Venture, because you're not sure what they're going to do with the funds or if they're going to use it right. You don't want to support any of these kind of actions or activities. And that is 100% understandable. But one of the things that I want to just sort of clarify is each of us, you and me, are responsible to God someday for what we did with the resources that we had in our lives, whether it was a whole lot or whether it was not much. We are going to give an account for the way that we lived our lives and the way that we stewarded what we were given. And the truth is, you're only responsible for a move of generosity in your own life. You're not responsible for what individuals or organizations or groups do with that. I know that sounds maybe kind of silly or foolish, but those organizations, those individuals are going to have to account someday for what they did. You have to account for what you did with your resources. And we want to be very careful as a church to make sure we're doing the best we can to steward those resources. We have an accountant looking over our books, making sure that everything is lining up. Our staff and our leadership have to get approval for expenditures above and beyond a limited amount of money. We have only a few people with the ability to approve and spend our resources, and most of our giving comes online. One of the things that does, it just means there are fewer hands that need to handle money. About 90% or more of our money comes through our online giving option. And we're grateful if you give cash here, and it does make a difference. But it does also make things a little messier when we have to have somebody track it and count it and deposit it. That's just one of the realities of those things. When we do this online, there's just a clearer cycle. Here's where the money's coming from, and here's where it's going. We are in good shape, Venture. And 2023 is going to go down as the best year we've ever had financially, including the years that we were part of the journey. And we're grateful for your generosity. But don't let your hesitancy about what we might do or any other organization might do be an excuse not to participate in generosity. We need you. We want you to experience what God is doing as he invites each of us to trust him and the abundance he's provided. But you go back to this story in Acts chapter 5, and some people are like, but what about them? Why did that happen? This whole case, doesn't it seem kind of extreme? It's one of these things is like, does the punishment really fit the crime? Like, yeah, they said one thing and they did another. They promised a certain amount but withheld some. Like, that's wrong. That's not taking steps of integrity, for sure. But dropping dead on the spot, doesn't that seem a little bit of an extreme kind of punishment? What's this whole thing about how they got buried immediately? Like, why exactly didn't they get an opportunity to like mourn? Usually we have a service or something. Like, what is going on in this whole situation? And I just want to clarify the reality for each of us because of the effects of sin in this world is that we all at some point in time in our lives do face our own end through death. That might be after decades on this earth, or it might be only a handful of years. Nobody can know the timing of any of this, and we need to be ready for that at any moment in our lives. That's just the reality that we live in. And oftentimes we pretend or we try to ignore the fact that that's part of our reality. But just one of the things that any day now, for any of us, could be that day. And the fact that Ananias and Sapphira, they died on the scene and were immediately buried. The only way to maybe make sense of this is the understanding that these first followers of Jesus were so aware of God's power and presence in their midst that they thought if these people were caught in an act of sin and the result was them dropping dead, that maybe if we don't get them outside of this community immediately, we might be threatened ourselves too. Like they might just have been afraid that if they didn't act immediately, the similar kind of fate might be headed for them as well. And one of the realities it talks about in that last verse, it says, great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events. We see throughout the book of Acts that these first followers of Jesus, they're so aware of God's presence, transforming them, changing lives, helping them understand that they are meant for life beyond this. They're so aware of it in the way that people are being healed and restored and renewed and invited into community and fellowship. But one of the ways that they're also aware of it too is through this, that God's real presence is amongst them, God's holy presence, his righteous presence. Go back to the very beginning of the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve, right? They were created as the first people on earth, and they were created in perfection. And they lived in this garden where everything that they needed was provided for them. They were experiencing the abundance and the blessing and the provision of God. They actually got to walk alongside God himself. And yet they were tempted, and they sinned against God by disobeying his rules, and then they tried to lie about it, and they tried to deceive God with it. And it is the beginning of the Bible story that helps us understand this unraveling of our world because of the brokenness and the consequences of sin through and through. What was the reality of Adam and Eve? That they took more than was allowed, and then they tried to deceive God about it, and they lied about their situation. And so God banished them from that garden. He said, you can't live in this place anymore. And in some ways, you might say, isn't that a little harsh? Like all it was like a fruit that they ate. But the reality is they had sinned against a perfect and a righteous and a holy God. And it was an act of mercy, actually, that God allowed them to live apart from his presence in that garden. Because we see from the Bible that the perfect and holy presence of God, within it, no sin can stand. And so if God had allowed them in their sin to exist in his presence, they would have been doomed. You see this in the book of Exodus. Moses has this encounter with God in chapter 33. He had gone up on a mountainside to meet with God. And it says this, the Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing you've asked because I am pleased with you and know you by name. Then Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. Then the Lord said, there's a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by you, I will put you in the cleft of a rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. What we see is that the glory and the radiance and the holiness of God overwhelms and obliterates the presence of sin. So there's this kind of interesting encounter with Moses and God where God's like, you want to see me, but you can't see me for who I fully am and live. It says, I will give you a glimpse of who I am, but if you see me for who I really am, it will be the end of you. Another spot in the Old Testament, book of Isaiah, chapter 6, the author Isaiah has this glimpse of the glory of God, and his only response is, woe is me, for I am ruined. I have seen the glory of the Lord, and I am a man of unclean lips, and I live amongst a people of unclean lips. Even though Isaiah was a great prophet in the Bible, he still was fully aware of his own sinfulness, his own brokenness. And in the presence of a holy God, he said, I am undone. It is over for me. What we see in Acts chapter 5 is this reality that in the presence of God, sin cannot be tolerated. That we cannot live these divided lives where we say one thing and do another, or we treat people in one situation one way and another different. We need to live lives that are leaning into the abundance, the presence that God gives us through Jesus. The truth is, Acts chapter 5 isn't a story about money. It's a story about our hearts. Ananias and Sapphira, they weren't living for God, but they were living for themselves. They were trying to get a reputation for being more generous and more righteous than they really were. They wanted to pretend to trust God with their resources, but in reality, they only really trusted themselves. It's kind of like saying, God, I will give you part of this, but I don't really trust you to have my best interest in mind. Ananias and Sapphira, they wanted the benefits of Jesus without the sacrifice of Jesus. And it cost them. It cost them dearly. I know when it comes to conversations about generosity, I think some of us think when I actually get money, then I'll be generous. But people have said over the years that all money does is make you more of who you already are. If you are generous when you are poor, you will be generous when you're rich. If you are stingy when you're poor, you're going to be stingy when you're rich. If you're miserable without anything, when you get money, you will still be miserable. If you are happy when you don't have very much, you'll just be happy when you get plenty as well. The reality is, if you're not generous with the little bit you have, you won't be generous when you get more. And we see that really what God is calling us to is trusting Him. It's an act of faith, right? One of the verses in the Bible, it says the greatest, there's faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, right? If we treat generosity the same, it says It's like saying this, that generosity is an act of faith. It's a way to say, God, I trust you. You know what I need, and I'm going to trust you to provide for my needs by giving back. Generosity is an act of hope. It's a way of saying, God, I want the world to know your goodness. God, I hope that more people might come to know you. And generosity is an act of love. It's a way to say, God, I worship you. I love you. I'm grateful for you, and I want to give back to you. Ananias and Sapphira, they didn't exercise any of these things. They weren't trusting God. They weren't giving so that the rest of the community might grow in the hope of Jesus. They were giving so their reputation might increase. And they weren't giving out of love, a way to worship God. They were giving, it must have been out of an act of duty, thinking they're going to expect something, but let's tell them this is what it is. And what we really see through the story of Ananias and Sapphira is an invitation to wholeness, to trust, to faith, to integrity in who we are. Like, if you don't have a ton, that is okay. Just be honest with what you have. If you've been living for your reputation more than as a way to see God in your life, learn to trust him in those things. If you're growing in your relationship with Jesus, whether you're at the very beginning or you've been walking with him forever, what does it look like for you to take a step in generosity with him? Maybe it's saying, I need to give for the first time ever. I'm a little scared about this, or I'm a little concerned. I don't even know what might happen with this. But again, you're not responsible for what an organization or individuals might do. They're responsible to God, just like Ananias and Sapphira were. You're responsible to God for the way you respond, the way he provides and blesses you in your own life. Or maybe you've been sort of on autopilot with your own giving in your own life, whether that's here at Venture or anywhere. And the truth is that you're giving more out of duty or obligation. And you need to examine your heart and just say, God, do I need to make some adjustments in my own life to the way that I've been treating generosity? Maybe giving more, maybe giving to more organizations or something like that. We want you to take steps into generosity, not just so that we flourish as a church. We want you to take steps in generosity because of what we talked about in the last part of Acts chapter 4, that generosity is the overflow of a transformed life. That when we're generous, it's because we understand what God has done for us. But I'm going to say one thing that I'm not sure a lot of people would say this way, but I'm just going to say it this way. If you're giving out of obligation or duty or spite, or if you're giving begrudgingly, saying, I'm giving this because I'm supposed to, but I don't really want to, would you actually stop? And I know that might sound counterintuitive, like, well, what if everybody stops giving? Well, here's the thing. Just like we want you to live into a life of faith and trusting God to provide, we're going to do that as an organization too. And I would much rather have people participating and taking steps in generosity amongst our community that are doing it out of a heart of gratitude and a transformed life than people are doing it because they think they have a reputation to protect, or they feel like they're obligated to do that. In fact, I'd be very scared if we look at this passage for those people. We want generosity to grow here, but we don't want that to be our main motivation. Our main motivation is we want people to experience the presence and the power and the goodness of the God that is at work within us. And as God is doing that, would generosity flow out of that so that more people might experience that goodness of God as well. The reality is we want people to come to know the truth that's described by Ananias' name. There's this irony in this story. It's a hard story. But Ananias, the main character, it's a Hebrew name. It means God is gracious. God is gracious. He didn't live into it, and he didn't trust. But it's given to us so that we may see that God is gracious to each of us, that we don't have to try to protect ourselves or plan our own ways or live for a reputation or live a divided life where we say one thing and do another. We can just live into the great goodness of God that's demonstrated on the cross through Jesus. That says, I love you right where you're at. And God demonstrated his grace to us, and that Jesus came to rescue us from ourselves and invite us into full life, new life, abundant life with him, now and forevermore. God is indeed gracious. And let our generosity flow out of that truth rather than trying to make generosity happen out of obligation or spite or any of those things. Would you pray with me? God, you are a gracious God, that you bless us abundantly beyond anything we deserve. And God, we pray that in our own lives, our hearts would grow out of appreciation for what you've done through us, trading your Son for us. And God, would you help us take steps of generosity that are in line with that hope that we have, that are in wholeness with who you're wanting us to be, that we don't have to pretend, we don't have to live for others' impressions, we don't have to try to protect a reputation. We can just be who we are, loved and known and rescued and redeemed by you. And let more people come to know and understand this hope that we have. And we love you. Amen.